Hi, given these days and what we're hearing in our counseling office, I wanted to spend some time talking a little bit about what it looks like to walk with children and teenagers through grief and loss. Before I get started, I want to introduce myself. Hi, my name is Rachel Hodges. I am the director of Caris Kids, which is the team of counselors who works with children, teenagers, and their families at Caris House Community Counseling Center. What you're doing right now is you're watching what we call a parent pause video. This is a time when we invite parents to pause, to take a deep breath, and to receive some encouragement and guidance for your journey. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's pause and take a deep breath. As much as you're able while you're watching this video, I'd love for you to find another way to care for yourself. Maybe grab a glass of water, maybe stretch, maybe just be mindful of the breaths you're taking as you're watching this. I'd love for this to be an actual pause. Okay, so as we're thinking about grief and loss, it's just so important that we acknowledge that we as humans live in a broken world, right? We are brought face to face with disappointment, loss, and suffering. Oftentimes, I know for myself and from talking with so many of you, so many parents, these are hard moments. These are oftentimes moments that we wish we could protect our children and our teens from pain. And sometimes we're able to, but oftentimes that's not possible. And so what we really want to grow in our understanding of and remembering is that because of the state of the world where there are things going on that that are hard and sad and that are ideally not how things would be unfolding, that grief is necessary, that it is our body's normal and natural way to respond to loss. And this can be hard to believe, I think especially sometimes in our culture, because our culture isn't necessarily known for lament. Sitting in grief and loss and sadness is something, this is a generalization, but oftentimes isn't something that we necessarily culturally give a lot of time or attention or investment in. And so this can feel really maybe not natural, but what we know is that grief is actually a really, really important process. So just want to remind us of that grief isn't something to shy away from or to be scared of, but what we really want to do is to make it possible for ourselves and for our kids to allow the grief process to unfold as a way to move us through the losses that we experience here. So when we think about grief, it's helpful to remember that grief is something that we can experience for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes we grieve changes, sometimes we grieve the loss of routine or events or failed expectations. Sometimes we grieve the loss of being able to trust in others because we're hurt in relationship or relationships changed. Sometimes we grieve unmet needs or sickness or illness or the unknown. And so there's all sorts of reasons why we grieve, and some we would say are very obvious and are easy to name and are related to a specific event, and other times we grieve things that are a little bit more ambiguous. It might be something under the surface, it might be something that isn't necessarily one specific event that people might understand from the outside, but it might be more of an internal loss or a relational loss, things like that. So today, as we talk about grief, since it is such a wide topic, we can't go into all the specifics about everything, but I wanted to start with this first parent pause video about grief, really looking at what are some guideposts for us as caregivers and as parents to really keep in mind as we're walking with our kiddos through grief. So that first guidepost I want to share with you is number one, we as caregivers, when we are walking with our kids through grief, one of the greatest gifts that we can give our children and our teenagers is to first put on our oxygen mask. Now, if any of you guys have ever flown in an airplane before, this is a known saying, right? When they're talking about if you're in the air and the oxygen mask come down, before you help your neighbor or a young child that is with you get their oxygen mask on, you must put yours on first. And we would say that this is very true for this for these seasons of walking through grief and loss with our kiddos, that it's really important for us to be mindful of our own grief and how we are making sense of a loss. Sometimes our kids are grieving things that we are not having simultaneous grief about, but oftentimes we are grieving things alongside of each other. And so we want to just be really mindful of what are our needs. Are we getting good rest and adequate nutrition? Are we able to get outside and exercise? Has there been time for us to connect with a friend or a loved one or a counselor or pastor and process anything we might need to process? It's really important that we are tending to ourselves so that we can then be available to tend to our children. Another part of this idea of putting on our oxygen mask that we often get questions about is related to, is it okay for kids to know that we are grieving and that we're sad? And we would say yes, that it is. That actually can be really helpful for our kids to see that mommy is sad about this too, or this is impacting daddy just like it's impacting me, that can actually give our children permission to feel and to express their emotions and to say what they're sad about. So you don't need to shy away from sharing if you're grieving or if you're disappointed about something. That being said, the one thing that we do want to be mindful of in those situations is we want to share those feelings and our thoughts about things in a way that still protects our children from feeling like they need to move into a caregiver or a caretaker role for us. So we want to be able to communicate like, I am sad and I'm disappointed about this, but I'll be okay, and I've got we are going to get through this. I'm going to lead you through this. Mommy has good friends who are helping her walk through this season. Things like that, where we're communicating, yes, I am sad, but I can still be your leader and I can still guide you through this season. Along with that, while it is good and okay for our kiddos to see our tears and our emotional expression, our concern, while those things are okay, we really want to be mindful of if it's possible to protect our kids from the intensity of our grief, right? Sometimes we need to have a good, hard cry, or we might have bigger, more overwhelming emotions. And if at all possible, it would, in an ideal circumstance, we would prefer to have our kids protected from those big emotions. That's not always possible. And so if they do see something like that, again, we just want to communicate like, yeah, mommy is sad, or I really am struggling, and I have people that I'm walking with through this. So just to protect our kids, again, from needing to be in a caretaker position for us. Okay, so that's the idea. Our first guidepost is put on our oxygen mask first. The next thing we want to consider as we think about grief for our children is we want to be aware of what is our own attitude and thoughts about grief. So it's helpful to remember that kids take their cues from us about the grief and about the grieving process and about being sad or concerned or confused about something or disappointed. So they will take their cues. Is grief something that we do in our family? Can I lean into what I'm feeling sad about? Or is this something that seems like we just don't really talk about it and we kind of, put it on the shelf and maybe navigate that on our own without one another? For some of us, based on our own story or what we've walked through, sometimes grief can seem really scary or overwhelming. And so if we're not aware of that or really mindful of that, those can be the messages that we pass on to our kids. So something that we might need to do as a caregiver, that you might need to do, is really consider how do I make sense of grief? And is it something that I welcome and I acknowledge as a part of what it means to be human in this world where so much has gone wrong? That's good for me to allow grief to do the work of moving me through the loss. And if I'm not there, what would it look like for me to maybe lean into this idea of grief and study it a little bit more, seek some counsel from wise friends or a pastor or a counselor, and really lean into kind of what is my relationship with grief like, and does it seem helpful in helping me move through losses, or does it leave me feeling stuck? So that being said, I wanted to talk a little bit about when we think about grief and loss, both obvious losses as well as some of those hidden losses I talked about earlier. We do know that there's some natural patterns of how we experience grief and loss as humans. And this isn't necessarily in a set order or a set length of time, but just so you know, to kind of normalize the grieving process, is oftentimes when we're met with grief, there can be seasons of numbness where we hear information and we're processing something, but we don't necessarily really feel anything. Oftentimes, in addition to there being seasons of numbness, there can also be seasons of having a really hard time concentrating or being able to focus. In addition to that, sometimes we have different physiological changes or routine changes where things like eating or sleeping are interfered with, that as our body really carries and walks through grief, it's impacted. What we also know is a very normal part of grief is that we do and we can experience really emotional highs as well as emotional lows. So it's helpful to just normalize those things, that's part of the grieving process. That's how, again, we move through the process of grief. Because sometimes that can help grief not feel so scary or alarming if we start to realize, oh yeah, I remember that grief can impact how we're sleeping, and now I see that my teenager is having a hard time sleeping in this season. That can help us put that in place of this is a part of the grieving process, and kind of sort out what to expect, and on the flip side, what not to be surprised by in these times of loss. Okay, so our first two guideposts, the first one was to put on our oxygen mask first, and the second one is to be aware of our own attitude and thoughts about grief. Moving into our third one, our third guidepost for walking with our children and teens through grief is to practice attuning to our child or our teenagers, to them. Practice attuning to our child. So when I say attuning, what I mean is we really want to pay attention to our child's emotions, their thoughts, and their behaviors. So the reason this is an important guidepost to know is that oftentimes, especially when we are grieving something at the same time that our child is grieving something, we are looking at them through the lens of our own grief. And without really cognitively realizing it, we are putting on our grieving experience and how we're making sense of a loss really onto them. So as much as we can, this idea of attunement is we want to be aware of how we're processing things. We want to be making sure that we're receiving the care that we need. And we also want to be able to see our child clearly and not only through the lens of our grief. So what that means is we want to pay attention to what is my child's emotional state? What is their behavior like right now? What can I tell from what they're saying and how they're acting, what their thoughts are about this situation? Again, we don't want to assume really how our child is making sense of something. We really want to practice looking at them and being curious based off of how they are and how kind of what we pick up on while we are with them. So it's important to know when we think about grief that sometimes grief can kind of bubble underneath the surface, and both our children and us as adults aren't able to access it even though it is there. And sometimes we can kind of call it out or invite it out in our children by saying something like, I think it seems like it's sad that you can't see your friends. Do you feel sad about that? And a simple statement like that can really invite them to feel it and say, yeah, I do feel sad about that. That might help them open up. It might not. That might move them to a place of tears, and that might feel alarming for you as a parent, but we would say, oh no, that's good. We want to invite those tears out if they're there. If they're there and we can invite them out, that is helpful. Tears are part of our healing process as humans. So if it seems like it's possibly brewing, if we can make little statements like that, when things feel safe and like you're connected, that can be a helpful way to call it out in our children. Again, because it affirms what they might feel that they don't necessarily have the words to say. Sometimes we can tell that things are brewing under the surface and aren't coming out when we start to see behaviors. Things like aggression or resistance or really seeking to be in control or in charge can show us that there's some emotional unrest in there. So that might be a cue that some of the grief is bubbling. And again, that they don't necessarily have the tools or the words or the cognitive ability to express what their internal experience is. So again, these are times that can be helpful for us to be curious and say, at a time when we have time to sit alongside of them and say, hey, I know that you're really upset that it didn't work out for you to get to go out with your friends tonight, but I'm also curious if maybe you're really frustrated or sad that so-and-so is moving next weekend. And that can be such a gift to our children, right? Can't that be such a gift to us as adults when someone sees us and says, I know you're upset about this, but I'm also wondering if this is involved. So that's the idea. We want to be attuned to our kiddo, to really look at them and see and be curious about what we can learn about where they're at based off of the words that they're saying, the emotions that they're expressing, their behaviors, and seek to be with them as we're curious about those things. Okay, our next guidepost is we want to keep at the forefront of our mind and to remember our kiddos' basic needs. Oftentimes in these times of grief or loss, stuff can be kind of hectic, and again, depending on how we make sense of grief, it can be easy to miss some of the normal things that we would think about all the time when we're taking care of our kids. So it's just helpful to remember in general what are our kiddos' basic needs and what are our basic needs as humans. And we would say we know first utmost we are relational creatures, right? We are mammals. We are social beings. And so our primary need is for connection and for relationship with other people, especially in times of emergency or loss. We are going to seek out another person. So one of the best ways we can invite our children and our teens to be cared for in the season is to allow them to come close to us and to have that time together. In these moments, we really want to generously welcome our children to come towards us and our teens to come towards us with their needs. So sometimes in seasons of loss or grief, we might notice that kids are asking us to do things for them that we know that they can do, that they're becoming a little bit more dependent or just feel maybe a little bit clingier. And we would say as much as possible to welcome that is actually their instinctual drive for closeness in the midst of loss or crisis. And that's a good and right instinct. As humans, that is usually where we go as relational people, as we seek to be together amidst loss. Okay, another basic needs, or one of the ways we want to think about our kids' needs, is through regulation. So Jill and I have talked a lot about this. If you haven't yet, check out our prior Parent Pause videos on regulation, but we really want to be aware of how our bodies are feeling and how their needs are being met in the midst of seasons of grief. Our bodies hold stress. We know that, right? We feel it. And so as much as possible, we just want to remember, how can I keep my kiddo regulated? How can I make sure that they're having proper water, nutrition, getting plenty of protein throughout the day? How can I make sure that they're getting adequate exposure to being able to move and to get enough sleep? All those great things that we've talked about before. Another way that we can be mindful of our kiddos' basic needs are to think about things like predictability. So all of us as humans, when things feel unpredictable or when we go through loss, if there can be routine and rituals, whether they were old ones that were in place that can be continued, or if some need to be adjusted based off of what has happened, helping maintain a new normal or adjusting, or helping to maintain what was normal or adjusting that and getting used to a new normal can be really helpful for children and for teens, so they can know what to expect. In addition to that, we also want to think about the importance of our kiddos just feeling safe and protected. We want to remember, especially for our younger children, that these feelings of safety and protection is experiential before it's necessarily cognitive. We'd say this is true for all humans, but especially for our young children, that we want to have the experience of feeling safe, knowing that we are safe and that we are protected. So we'll talk about this in a little bit, but part of that really includes we want to be wise about what we do share with our kids and teens and what we don't. It is good and right for us to shield them from things that are too big or too scary or too much that they don't need to have exposure to or knowledge of yet. That's one of the things we can do as parents and as caregivers, is to really take the lead in being protectors for them. And then lastly, we want to remember this idea of comfort and soothing as one of our basic needs. So we can take the lead in helping to soothe our children, to help them feel held and assured that they will be cared for, that they have us as caregivers to lead them through this time, that even though there are unknowns, that we will be with them and that they won't be facing this alone. Again, when we're in times of stress, our body gets worked up and activated, and so if we can, as caregivers, take the lead in helping to soothe and comfort, that can really serve our children in a lot of big ways. And those are things that oftentimes, and I would imagine you're probably doing without necessarily even thinking about it or realizing that that is what's happening in those moments of connection with your kids. Okay, our fifth guidepost is we want to allow ample time for true play. So while there is a lot of expression and emotional release that can come through our tears, we know that there's also a huge value in play, and that it's actually in true deep play that our kids actually, and I think us as adults too, work out a lot of the emotional experience that we carry, that a lot of this is worked out through play. So when I talk about play and about true deep play, I want you to think about and remember two things. We want to think about how can we cultivate times for our kiddos to really explore and be curious, as well as to create. So we want to think about open-ended play as much as possible, about elements of discovery, of expression, of exploration, like I said. And the things we kind of want to shy away from when we think about deep play, or this more, of deep play, is we want to avoid play that is outcome focused or focused on competition or achievement. We would say that those types of things in and of themselves aren't necessarily wrong, but they don't allow the same sort of working out that some of the other types of play do. So again, we want to allow ample time for true play. So I would say that this is true for children, but it's also true for us as adults. If you can find ways and know what is your play pattern and style, that can be such a helpful way to care for yourself in these seasons. When you think about self-care and how to make space for you to work things out. Okay, and lastly, our last guidepost for walking with our children through grief and walking with our teens through grief is just want to remind you that you know your kid. That oftentimes in times of uncertainty or surprise, we do find ourselves looking outside for guidance and for help and for wisdom, and we definitely think that that can be useful at times, but we also, I just want to encourage you that we know that you know your specific children. And so while it is, in the specific season while we're walking through the pandemic and all of the surprising changes and losses that have come with that, while we might not have walked through that before in our lifetimes, I imagine that you have walked with your child and with your teenager through other losses and disappointment. So I just want to invite you to, as you're considering this idea of grief and your how to walk with your child through grief, I want to encourage you to think about each of your specific children and ask questions like, in the past, what has helped your child to be comforted? What has brought your child soothing? Also want to ask you to consider when are times that you and your child feel really connected? When are times or environments that have led you to feeling that togetherness, have led to a bonding conversation, have led to that experience of shared joy or understanding. Also invite you to think about things like, when is your child most able to engage with true play? What in the past has helped my child find their tears? So I just invite you to think through those types of questions, think through your specific kid, maybe think through prior losses and how you guys were as a family able to navigate that, what felt like moved you forward, and maybe what areas did you feel more stuck. And so again, we want to remember as much as possible that grief, given the circumstances of our world, which, as believers, we know we are created for a garden that was beautiful and perfect, where we felt connected and seen and soothed and all of our needs were met. And we just know that where we live now is so far from that garden, and that there's brokenness and suffering all around us. And so as humans, grief is the way that we respond to suffering. And so it's good for us to remember that, to know that that is a healthy process for us to move through, and that us as parents, one of the greatest gifts that we can give our children is to learn how to make space for our own grief, as well as to make space to grieve alongside of our kids, and to invite them to follow our lead in that grief. So I just want to encourage you parents, in the midst of how difficult in general it can be to be a parent and to be a caregiver and to contend with all the things we're contending with today, it can be so easy to forget that what our kiddos really long for, and what our teens long for, is for a connected relationship with us, with their caregivers, to be encouraged by us, to be guided, that's a natural order of things for us to be their leader and to get to guide them through life. So just encourage you with that. I know sometimes it can feel like they need so much more, but there's so much power in the ways that you delight in your children, that you express your enjoyment of them, that you encourage, that you snuggle and hug, that you play catch in the backyard, or take them to go grab ice cream, that these little things really do matter to your kids and to your teens. It's so, so powerful. So I hope that this was helpful today, as we have talked about our primary, or these 6 guideposts for parenting through grief. I'm going to review them really fast, or not really fast. I'm going to talk through them one more time just to remind you of everything you've learned in our time today. So we want to think about putting on our oxygen mask first. We want to be aware of our own personal attitude and thoughts about grief. We want to be mindful of how to see our child, or attune to our child, by being aware of their emotions and thoughts and behaviors, and making sure that we're seeing them and not applying our own grief to how they are grieving. We want to remember their basic needs and the value of keeping that at the forefront of our mind when we walk through these seasons of losses. We want to allow ample time for true play, and we want to remember that we know our kid, and that there's a lot of power in just remembering what we already know about them based off of our experience in being in a relationship with them. So with that being said, if you would like to continue to dive into the topic of grief, we're going to continue to talk about it with our Parent Pause videos. So there will be some other videos available regarding specific developmental stages and how that plays out in specific developmental stages and how grief plays out in each stage. And then we also will be having our next live Parent Pause on June 2nd will be about grief and loss and disappointment. So if you have specific questions you'd like us to answer, whether it's before June 2nd or after, feel free to email us at parentpause@thejourney.org, and we would love to engage with those questions in one of our future Parent Pause videos. Okay, thank you so much for joining me today. As we close out, I want to invite you to take a deep breath. All right, remember parents, you're doing a great job, and you are worthy of the same care that you're seeking to provide for your child, and you and your child are deeply loved. Take care.